Guilt is one of the most powerful and uniquely human emotions, yet we rarely stop to question where it comes from or why we feel it so deeply. At first glance, guilt may seem like a psychological burden, an uncomfortable emotion that weighs on us long after we've made a mistake. But when we look through the lens of evolution, a different picture emerges. Guilt is not a flaw in the human design. It is a feature. It is an emotion shaped by millions of years of social living, crafted to strengthen cooperation, ensure survival, and maintain harmony within complex groups. To understand guilt is to understand the foundations of human morality itself. In the early stages of human evolution, survival depended on social groups. No early human could thrive alone. Cooperation was essential for hunting, gathering, protecting offspring, and defending territory. In such environments, behaviors that harmed the group, stealing, lying, hoarding resources, or breaking trust, threatened not only relationships, but the survival of everyone involved. Natural selection favored psychological mechanisms that reduce these conflicts. Guilt, as an internal alarm system, evolved to prevent actions that might damage group cohesion. The core purpose of guilt is simple: discourage harmful behavior and motivate corrective action. When early humans violated social expectations, the discomfort of guilt pushed them to repair the damage. Guilt kept the group functioning smoothly. Long before written laws, religious rules, or philosophical ideas of morality existed. In essence, guilt is one of the earliest and most primitive forms of internal moral governance. You didn't need someone to punish you. Your own mind did the job. Anthropologists widely acknowledge that guilt appears most strongly in species that rely heavily on cooperation. Though animals can show signs of distress after wrongdoing, humans experience guilt far more intensely and cognitively. This is because guilt is tied to our advanced ability to imagine how others feel, interpret social reactions, and anticipate consequences. These abilities form what psychologists call theory of mind, the capacity to understand the emotions and intentions of others. As our ancestors grew more socially intelligent, guilt became more refined. It evolved to serve as a bridge between personal choices and collective welfare. One evolutionary theory proposes that guilt strengthens the social contract by making individuals trustworthy. Guilt-prone individuals are more likely to avoid cheating or betrayal because the emotional cost is high. Groups with more guilt-sensitive members tended to be more cooperative, more stable, and more successful in survival and reproduction. Over thousands of generations, this emotional trait became embedded in our species. Even today, people who feel guilt more strongly are often more reliable, more empathetic, and more committed to maintaining positive relationships. Another evolutionary explanation focuses on reputation management. In small ancestral groups, reputation was everything. If someone was known for selfish or harmful behavior, they risked exclusion, a death sentence in the prehistoric world. Guilt became an internal warning system to protect reputation before damage occurred. The emotion helped individuals avoid behaviors that would lead to shame, rejection, or punishment. In this way, guilt served as a kind of psychological shield, protecting not only relationships, but one's place within the group. But guilt didn't just evolve to stop harmful actions, it also evolved to repair them. When guilt strikes after wrongdoing, it motivates behaviors that restore social bonds, offering an apology, showing remorse, or compensating the person harmed. These actions reduce resentment, rebuild trust, and reassure others that the violation won't happen again. From an evolutionary standpoint, the ability to repair relationships quickly was a major advantage. Groups with effective conflict resolution were more resilient and less likely to fragment. Interestingly, guilt is also closely tied to empathy, the ability to feel what others feel. Empathy allows us to sense the emotional impact of our actions, while guilt pushes us to act on that awareness. The two emotions evolve together, working as a moral compass that guides social behavior. Without empathy, guilt would be shallow. Without guilt, empathy would lack direction. Together, they form the foundation of human morality long before humans created moral systems. Of course, guilt also had to be balanced. Too little guilt creates selfishness, exploitation, and unstable groups. Too much guilt, on the other hand, results in paralysis, fear of mistakes, and excessive self-punishment. Evolution did not design guilt to torment us, but to regulate behavior efficiently. In healthy amounts, guilt promotes accountability and growth. In excessive amounts, it becomes counterproductive, something later sections of your video can explore. What's remarkable about guilt is how deeply ingrained it is. Even young children display early signs of guilt, often without being explicitly taught. Developmental studies show that toddlers, as young as 2 years old, show visible discomfort when they break a rule or cause harm. This early emergence suggests that guilt has strong biological roots. It is not just a cultural invention, it is a natural part of being human. However, culture does shape guilt's expression. In individualistic societies, guilt often focuses on personal responsibility, the idea that I did something wrong and I should make it right. In collectivist societies, guilt may emphasize how one's actions affect the group, family, or community. But beneath these cultural differences, the fundamental evolutionary purpose remains the same: maintain harmony, restore balance, and strengthen social bonds. Today, guilt continues to guide our behavior in countless ways. It influences the decisions we make at work, the way we treat our friends and family, and how we respond when we break our own moral principles. Even in modern life, with laws, technologies, and social systems far more complex than those of our ancestors, guilt still functions as a built-in moral compass. It reminds us that our actions matter, that relationships require care, and that accountability is essential. Ultimately, guilt is the emotional glue that holds human society together. It keeps us conscious of our impact on others, encourages empathy, and motivates repair when things go wrong. Far from being a negative emotion we should avoid, guilt is a key part of what makes us moral beings. It pushes us toward better behavior, strengthens the bonds we rely on, and reflects our deep evolutionary roots as social animals. Guilt feels like an emotion of the heart, a tightening in the chest, a heaviness in the stomach, a voice whispering that something is wrong. But the real story of guilt does not begin in the heart. It begins in the brain. Behind every moment of regret, every pang of conscience, and every impulse to make things right, lies a complex network of neural circuits working silently to shape our moral experience. Understanding the neurobiology of guilt reveals that morality is not just philosophy or culture. It is wired into the architecture of the human brain. At its core, guilt is a self-conscious emotion. Unlike basic emotions such as fear or anger, which react to external threats, guilt emerges when we evaluate ourselves. It is the brain looking inward, comparing our actions to our moral values and social expectations. This reflective quality requires advanced cognitive machinery, and guilt draws on multiple interconnected regions that evolved over millions of years. One of the most important structures involved in guilt is the prefrontal cortex, particularly the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or VMPFC. This region serves as the brain's emotional decision-making center. It helps us weigh consequences, regulate impulses, and judge right from wrong. When we contemplate past behavior or anticipate future actions, the VMPFC integrates emotional and rational inputs to evaluate whether those actions align with our moral code. People with damage to this area often show reduced guilt, impaired empathy, and difficulty understanding social norms, a striking demonstration of how deeply morality is tied to brain structure. Another key player is the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC. This region acts like the brain's conflict monitor, a neural alarm system that detects when our behavior clashes with our internal standards. When we act against our values, the ACC lights up, signaling that something requires attention. This neural signal is often the first spark of guilt, an uncomfortable recognition that we've crossed a line. Without the ACC's ability to detect conflict between our actions and our principles, we would struggle to recognize wrongdoing at all. But guilt is not just detection, it is emotional weight. This is where the insula comes in. The insula generates the visceral bodily sensations associated with moral emotions, the sinking feeling, the knot in the stomach, the unease that pushes us toward correction. Neuroscientists have found that the insula becomes highly active when people imagine harming others or violating moral rules. In this sense, guilt is not merely an abstract judgment. It is a physical experience encoded in the brain's emotional networks. The amygdala, typically associated with fear, also plays an important role in guilt. It helps us emotionally process the consequences of our actions and learn from them. When we experience guilt, the amygdala records the emotional intensity of the mistake, making it less likely that we will repeat it. This emotional memory function shows how guilt evolved as a learning mechanism, a way to steer our behavior towards socially accepted paths. Together, these regions, the prefrontal cortex, the ACC, the insula, and the amygdala, form the core guilt circuit. But guilt also relies on another uniquely human capacity: theory of mind, the ability to imagine what others think and feel. This ability depends heavily on the temporoparietal junction, TPJ. When you think about how your actions affected someone else, or when you imagine their disappointment or pain, the TPJ activates. Without this ability to step into another person's perspective, guilt would lose its social meaning. But how does the brain decide when guilt is appropriate? The answer lies in the interplay between memory, emotion, and moral reasoning. When a potential wrongdoing occurs, the prefrontal cortex retrieves relevant memories, past experiences, learned moral rules, and social expectations. The ACC evaluates whether a violation occurred. If it did, the insula generates emotional discomfort, while the amygdala embeds the emotional significance of the event. This integrated neural response becomes the subjective experience we call guilt. Neuroscientists can observe this process directly through brain imaging. When participants recall a moment they feel guilty about, these regions repeatedly activate and sync. The pattern is so consistent that researchers can often distinguish guilt from other moral emotions, such as shame or embarrassment, based solely on brain activity. Interestingly, guilt tends to activate more cognitive and empathetic regions, while shame activates areas associated with self-focused distress and social rejection. This supports psychological findings. Guilt focuses on actions, whereas shame targets identity. What's also fascinating is how the brain distinguishes real guilt from imagined guilt. Humans have the capacity to feel guilty not only for what they've done, but for what they could do, what they almost did, or what they imagine doing. This anticipatory guilt relies heavily on the prefrontal cortex, which simulates future scenarios and judges them according to social or moral rules. In this way, guilt becomes preventative, guiding behavior before harm even occurs. Another essential aspect of guilt's neurobiology involves social reinforcement. The brain's reward system, particularly the striatum, becomes active when we repair a wrongdoing. Apologizing, helping the person we harmed, or taking responsibility activates reward pathways and releases neurotransmitters such as dopamine and oxytocin. These chemicals make reconciliation and cooperation feel good, reinforcing corrective behavior. In other words, the brain rewards us for restoring social harmony. This reward mechanism reveals that guilt is not designed to punish us endlessly. Biologically, guilt is meant to be resolved. The brain pushes us to acknowledge the wrongdoing, repair the damage, and then move on. When guilt lingers beyond this purpose, becoming chronic or tied to unrealistic self-expectations, the neurobiological system becomes dysregulated. Overactivity in the ACC and insula, for example, is associated with rumination, anxiety, and depressive symptoms. Individuals may become trapped in a cycle of self-blame, even when they've done nothing wrong. This imbalance between emotional and cognitive networks transforms a useful moral signal into psychological suffering. On the other hand, people with reduced guilt responses, often linked to abnormalities in the prefrontal cortex or amygdala, may struggle with empathy and moral understanding. This is commonly observed in antisocial personality traits, where the neural circuits for guilt and remorse operate differently. These findings underscore that guilt is not simply a choice or a learned behavior. It is deeply biological. Guilt and shame are two of the most powerful moral emotions humans experience. They sit side by side in our psychological landscape, often overlapping, often confused, yet fundamentally different in their purpose, structure, and impact on our lives. At first glance, both emotions feel similar, a sense that something is wrong, a discomfort that lingers inside us, but beneath the surface, guilt and shame follow different neural pathways, shape behavior in different ways, and influence our relationships, identities, and mental health differently. To truly understand the moral architecture of the human mind, we must explore not just what these emotions feel like, but why they exist and how they operate. The simplest way to distinguish guilt from shame is this. Guilt judges the action. Shame judges the self. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am wrong. This difference may seem subtle, but it shapes the entire emotional experience. When we feel guilt, our attention is directed outward, toward the behavior, the consequences, and the person we may have harmed. Guilt invites us to repair, to apologize, to make things right. Shame, however, turns our gaze inward, often painfully so. It tells us that our mistake reflects who we are. Shame collapses the entire self into a single failure. This collapse is what makes shame so heavy, so overwhelming, and so destructive when left unchecked. From an evolutionary perspective, guilt and shame developed to serve different social functions. Guilt evolved to protect relationships. It motivates repair, accountability, and reconciliation within the group. When guilt rises, it pushes us to fix what we broke. This makes us more trustworthy, more cooperative, and ultimately more valuable to the community. Shame, on the other hand, evolved as a mechanism to prevent social rejection. In early human societies, being cast out from the group meant starvation, danger, and death. Shame helped individuals conform to social expectations, avoid behaviors that would provoke disgust or exclusion, and maintain acceptable status within the tribe. But the strategies these two emotions use are very different. Guilt asks, what can I do to repair the damage? Shame asks, how can I hide this part of myself? Where guilt moves us toward others, shame often isolates us. Guilt encourages connection. Shame encourages avoidance. This is why guilt generally leads to healthier outcomes, greater empathy, stronger relationships, deeper self-reflection. Shame, in contrast, is more likely to produce withdrawal, denial, anger, or defensiveness. Instead of repairing the harm, shame can make us hide it, lie about it, or project blame onto others. The psychological weight of shame is also far heavier. While guilt can be uncomfortable, it usually has a clear path forward. Admit the mistake, make amends, learn from it. Shame offers no such escape. Because shame attacks our identity, it can lead to feelings of worthlessness, inadequacy, and self-hate. Research consistently shows that chronic shame is associated with anxiety, depression, addiction, and low self-esteem. Guilt, when balanced, is linked to healthier social behavior, empathy, and moral growth. Neuroscience helps clarify this divide. Guilt primarily activates brain regions associated with empathy, evaluation, and corrective action, such as the prefrontal cortex and temporoparietal junction. These areas help us understand others' feelings and consider what we should do next. Shame, however, activates regions associated with self-focus, aversion, and social pain, such as the dorsal anterior, cingulate cortex, and parts of the insula. These neural patterns reflect the emotional experience itself. Guilt is outward and corrective. Shame is inward and painful. The body's reaction to each emotion also differs. Guilt feels like a weight, a nagging reminder to address a mistake. Shame, however, often comes with a strong physical urge to hide, collapse, or disappear. That sinking feeling in the stomach, the flush in the face, the instinct to avoid eye contact. These are the body's ancient responses to perceived social unworthiness. Shame is not just emotional distress, it is the body preparing for rejection. Despite their differences, the two emotions are often intertwined. A single event can trigger both. You might feel guilty for hurting someone, and ashamed because that action contradicts your sense of who you are. In these moments, the challenge is to separate the two, to recognize that a bad action does not make you a bad person. This separation is crucial because guilt leads to growth, shame leads to paralysis. In relationships, the difference between guilt and shame can determine whether conflict ends in healing or in further damage. When partners approach each other with guilt, acknowledging wrongdoing and seeking repair, trust is often strengthened. But when someone responds with shame, they may deny the issue, shut down, or lash out defensively. The shame is so painful that accepting responsibility feels unbearable. This is why many conflicts stall, not because of the mistake, but because of the shame surrounding it. Culturally, guilt and shame play different roles. Western individualistic societies tend to emphasize guilt, focusing on personal responsibility and internal conscience. Many Eastern and collectivist societies emphasize shame, highlighting social harmony, reputation, and the perception of the community. Neither approach is inherently wrong. They simply reflect different survival strategies shaped by different cultural histories. But understanding these differences helps explain why some cultures respond to wrongdoing through personal apology, while others prioritize restoring honor or maintaining group cohesion. There is also a moral dimension to consider. Guilt is often associated with ethical accountability. It acknowledges the harm done and compels us to repair it. Shame, however, can push people to hide wrongdoing rather than confront it. In extreme cases, shame can motivate people to maintain harmful behaviors simply because admitting the truth would be too humiliating. This makes shame a double-edged sword, useful for social conformity, but dangerous when it becomes internalized as self-worth. The most important lesson is this: guilt is about behavior, shame is about identity. And because identity is far more fragile, shame can erode the very foundation of a person's emotional well-being. The key is learning to shift from shame to guilt, to see mistakes as actions we can change, not as reflections of who we are. This shift transforms moral emotions from burdens into tools for growth. Guilt says you can repair the damage. Shame says you are the damage, and that is the crucial difference. When we understand this distinction, we gain insight not just into morality, but into ourselves. We learn how to approach others with compassion, how to hold ourselves accountable without self-destruction, and how to cultivate emotional resilience. Guilt can be a guide. Shame can be a trap. The challenge of human development is learning which voice to listen to. Guilt is often described as a universal human emotion, something every culture recognizes, something every individual everywhere in the world has felt at least once. But while guilt itself may be universal, the meaning we attach to it, the situations that trigger it, and the ways we respond to it vary dramatically across cultures. The emotional landscape of guilt is shaped not only by individual psychology, but also by collective history, social structures, religious traditions, and cultural values. To understand guilt fully, we must look beyond the individual mind and explore the cultural environments that shape how guilt is learned, expressed, and interpreted. At the heart of cultural differences in guilt lies one of the most fundamental distinctions in anthropology: guilt cultures versus shame cultures. Though simplified, this framework helps illustrate how societies use emotions to regulate behavior. In what are often called guilt cultures, such as many Western societies, moral life is guided primarily by an internalized sense of right and wrong. Individuals are encouraged to develop a personal conscience that evaluates their own actions. When someone breaks a rule, the discomfort they feel comes mainly from within, from violating their own standards. Personal responsibility, autonomy, and self-correction are key. In these cultures, guilt functions as a moral compass that guides behavior, even when no one else is watching. By contrast, shame cultures, more common in parts of East Asia, the Middle East, Africa, and many indigenous communities, place stronger emphasis on social perception. Here, the primary concern is not the action itself, but how that action reflects on one's family, group, or community. The fear of bringing dishonor or losing social standing plays a central role in moral life. In such cultures, wrongdoing is not just a personal failure, it is a social stain. Guilt still exists, but it is often overshadowed by shame, the emotional weight of failing to uphold one's role within the larger social fabric. But these categories are not fixed or mutually exclusive. Every culture contains elements of both guilt and shame, and they often interact in complex ways. What differs is the balance, the emotional emphasis that each society highlights and transmits across generations. Western cultures, shaped by centuries of individualism, personal freedom, and religious traditions emphasizing personal sin, tend to favor guilt as the primary moral emotion. The idea of confession, atonement, and making things right reflects a guilt-based moral framework. In Christianity, for example, guilt is a central component of the relationship between the individual and God. Wrongdoing is often framed as a personal moral violation that can be corrected through repentance and forgiveness. This focus on internal conscience echoes in modern Western life, in justice systems that emphasize personal responsibility, in psychological therapies centered on self-awareness, and in social norms that prioritize authenticity and personal integrity. Meanwhile, Eastern cultures, particularly those influenced by Confucianism, Buddhism, and collectivist traditions, prioritize social harmony over individual autonomy. Here, shame plays a prominent role, not as a punishment, but as a social signal. Shame encourages individuals to align their actions with group expectations and to protect relationships from disruption. In Japan, for instance, the concept of hansei refers to deep self-reflection after a mistake, not just feeling guilty for an action, but feeling responsible for restoring harmony. In China, faith in social reputation, dignity, and honor is central to moral life. Losing face brings shame not only on oneself, but on one's entire family or group. In these societies, guilt is still present, but it is deeply intertwined with one's social identity. In Middle Eastern and North African cultures, communal identity plays a powerful role in shaping guilt. Honor-based frameworks emphasize the importance of reputation, hospitality, loyalty, and family standing. A wrongdoing may evoke guilt for the act itself, but it is the shame associated with damaging the family's honor that often carries the heavier emotional weight. However, within close relationships, between family members, spouses, or friends, guilt functions similarly to any other culture, a mechanism to maintain trust, repair harm, and reinforce moral expectations. In indigenous cultures, guilt is often understood relationally. Instead of viewing guilt as a personal moral failure, many indigenous traditions frame wrongdoing as a disruption of balance between people, nature, and the spiritual world. Guilt, in this context, is not an internal punishment, but a sign that harmony needs to be restored. Rituals, community dialogue, and restorative justice practices are often used to repair damage in a way that reconnects individuals with the community. This relational view of guilt shows how morality does not need to be individualistic to be deep and meaningful. Religious traditions around the world also shape how guilt is experienced. In Christianity, guilt is tied to sin, confession, and redemption. In Islam, guilt is connected to moral accountability and the responsibility to seek forgiveness from both God and the people harmed. In Hinduism and Buddhism, guilt is often interwoven with karma. Actions have consequences that shape future outcomes, and moral growth involves self-correction and mindfulness. These traditions cultivate different emotional landscapes, encouraging believers to view guilt either as a moral guide, a call for repentance, or a reminder of spiritual consequences. Modern globalization has blurred many of these boundaries. Western individualism is spreading through media and technology, influencing young people even in traditionally collectivist cultures. Meanwhile, mental health awareness, driven largely by Western psychology, is reshaping how guilt and shame are understood globally. The rise of social media adds another layer. Guilt now intertwines with digital norms, responding late, missing a message, not maintaining a certain online image. This digital guilt emerges across cultures, transcending traditional boundaries. Despite cultural differences, certain themes are universal. In every society, guilt helps maintain relationships, enforce norms, and encourage moral behavior. The way guilt is expressed may differ: internal confession in one culture, public apology in another, but its social purpose remains the same: to repair what is broken, to realign the self with community expectations, and to guide individuals toward more responsible and compassionate behavior. Guilt is often described as an inner voice, a quiet whisper that tells us when we've crossed a line, disappointed someone, or acted in a way that conflicts with our values. But beneath this personal emotional layer lies a much larger force: guilt as a powerful tool of social regulation. Throughout human evolution, our survival depended not only on our individual abilities, but on our capacity to live together, cooperate, and maintain harmony within groups. Guilt became one of the invisible mechanisms that kept those groups functional, cohesive, and predictable. It is not merely a feeling of personal regret. It is a social signal, a pressure that guides behavior even when no one is watching. At the heart of social guilt is the awareness of others. Humans evolved to be deeply sensitive to how they are perceived within their community. Long before modern society, our ancestors lived in small groups where every action had immediate consequences. Food sharing, child care, hunting, and protection were all communal responsibilities. If someone failed to contribute or intentionally harmed another group member, the cost wasn't abstract. Trust eroded, cooperation weakened, and ultimately the group's survival was threatened. Guilt emerged as an internal alarm system, warning individuals that their actions risk social damage. It helped discourage selfish impulses and encourage reparative behavior, making it essential for group cohesion. This internal emotional response has a unique power because it activates before punishment is even applied. Someone who feels guilt doesn't need to be caught or scolded. The emotion itself compels them to correct their behavior or seek forgiveness. In this way, guilt became an efficient social regulator. Societies didn't have to rely solely on external enforcement. Guilt worked from the inside out, keeping individuals aligned with group norms. In fact, the feeling of guilt often intensifies not when we harm someone, but when we imagine how that person might feel, or how the group might judge our actions. The emotional discomfort serves as a deterrent before wrongdoing even occurs. Social norms amplify this mechanism. Every community has expectations, spoken or unspoken, about what behavior is acceptable. These norms are taught through parents, culture, peer groups, and institutions. As we internalize them, guilt takes root as a response to even the thought of violating norms. A child who is taught to share may feel a pang of guilt when refusing to offer a toy. An adult may feel guilty for canceling plans, showing up late, or not replying to a message. These small forms of guilt reveal how deeply embedded social expectations have become in our daily decision-making. But social guilt is not just about conformity. It is tied to connection. When people care about a relationship, romantic, familial, or social, they are more likely to feel guilt when they think they've wronged the other person. Guilt signals empathy. It shows that we understand our actions have emotional consequences for someone else. This empathy-driven guilt strengthens bonds because it motivates apology, repair, and reassurance. Without guilt, relationships would fracture easily, and conflicts would escalate. In this sense, guilt is one of the emotional threads that keeps human social networks intact. Yet the same mechanism that supports cooperation can become a source of pressure or manipulation. Social guilt can be amplified artificially by people, institutions, or cultures to control behavior. Parents may use guilt to shape their children's actions. After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me. Romantic partners may use guilt to avoid accountability or to steer decisions. Even society at large uses guilt to enforce ideals of productivity, appearance, morality, and success. Advertisers play on social guilt by suggesting that without a certain product, you are neglecting your responsibilities, to your family, your health, your status. Because guilt is tied so deeply to social expectations, it can grow disproportionate. People may feel guilty not because they've done something wrong, but because they fear disappointing others. They might apologize excessively, take responsibility for problems that aren't theirs, or avoid conflict out of fear of being judged. In these moments, guilt stops being a guide and becomes a burden, an exaggerated form of social self-monitoring that restricts personal freedom and emotional well-being. Interestingly, guilt is also selective. We tend to feel it most strongly toward people whose opinions matter to us: parents, partners, close friends, communities we identify with. This selectivity reveals an important truth. Social guilt is less about universal morality and more about the dynamics of our relationships. Guilt has always been intertwined with morality. It acts as an emotional compass, pointing us toward what we believe is right and away from what we sense is wrong. But beyond the personal discomfort we feel after a mistake, moral guilt plays a crucial role in guiding ethical decision-making. It helps shape our judgment, our behavior, and the values that define us as individuals and as societies. At its core, moral guilt is not simply about breaking rules. It is about violating principles that we have internalized as part of our identity. Moral guilt begins with awareness. From childhood, we learn that certain actions cause harm, break trust, or violate the expectations of the people around us. These lessons become encoded into our moral framework. When we grow older, this internal code becomes more sophisticated. It expands beyond avoiding punishment and becomes tied to empathy, responsibility, and fairness. The moment we act in a way that contradicts our moral beliefs, guilt emerges. The emotion is a warning signal, reminding us that our actions have deviated from the person we aspire to be. This internal signal is one of the reasons guilt is so effective. External rules, laws, social norms, or religious teachings can influence behavior, but moral guilt operates from within. When a person feels guilty, it is not because someone else is forcing accountability. It is the self-evaluating itself. This internal evaluation makes guilt one of the most powerful forces in ethical decision-making. Even in private moments, when no one is watching, guilt pushes individuals to choose the option aligned with their values. In this way, guilt reinforces moral integrity and encourages actions that reflect a deeper sense of personal responsibility. A major component of moral guilt is empathy. When people imagine the emotional impact their actions may have on others, guilt naturally arises. For example, lying, cheating, or causing emotional pain can trigger guilt, not simply because these actions are socially unacceptable, but because we understand how they affect another human being. This empathetic guilt motivates us to be honest, fair, and considerate. It helps maintain trust in relationships and ensures that our ethical decisions are rooted in compassion rather than convenience or self-interest. However, moral guilt can become more complex when individuals face dilemmas, situations in which there is no clear right or wrong, or in which every option carries consequences. Ethical decision-making often involves weighing values against each other: loyalty versus honesty, personal benefit versus fairness, comfort versus justice. In these moments, guilt becomes a guide. It highlights the potential moral cost of each choice and pushes individuals to examine their motives more deeply. People often choose the option that minimizes guilt or aligns most closely with their long-term values. Even when the decision is painful, guilt helps shape the outcome by revealing which choice feels morally sustainable. For societies, guilt plays an important role in maintaining order and encouraging ethical behavior more broadly. Legal systems rely heavily on guilt as a basis for justice. The concept of guilt in law is not only an emotional feeling, but a formal determination of responsibility. When someone is declared guilty, the system asserts that they have violated a collective moral standard. This reinforces societal norms and sends a message about the behavior that the community values and protects. Even outside the courtroom, guilt influences how individuals perceive wrongdoing and how they assign responsibility in social conflicts. But moral guilt is not always a perfect guide. Sometimes it is shaped by cultural or religious expectations rather than universal principles. What generates guilt in one society may not do so in another. For example, some cultures emphasize collective duty, and failing to fulfill group obligations may cause guilt, even if no direct harm is done. In other cultures, guilt is tied more to personal integrity and individual moral choices. These differing structures influence how people make ethical decisions and how deeply they feel guilt over specific actions. Another complexity arises when guilt is disproportionate. Some individuals experience moral guilt even when they are not at fault, or when the harm caused is minimal. This form of excessive guilt can transform from a helpful guide into a burden. It can lead to over-apologizing, self-blame, or avoidance of situations where mistakes are possible. In severe cases, excessive guilt becomes intertwined with anxiety or depression, making it difficult for individuals to trust their moral judgment. Ethical decision-making becomes clouded not by the desire to do right, but by fear of doing wrong. Guilt is often understood as a moral compass, a healthy emotional response that encourages responsibility, empathy, and growth. But like any emotion, it has a darker side. When guilt becomes constant, disproportionate, or impossible to resolve, it transforms from a guiding force into a psychological burden. Chronic guilt, guilt that lingers long after the triggering event, or emerges even when no wrong has been committed, can shape a person's thoughts, behavior, and identity in profound and damaging ways. Instead of helping someone become better, it traps them in a cycle of self-blame and emotional exhaustion that affects mental health on every level. Chronic guilt usually begins subtly. It might arise after a mistake, a moment of regret, or a conflict with someone important. In a healthy mind, guilt motivates apology or repair, then gradually fades. But for some, the guilt doesn't leave. Even after making amends, the mind replays the moment repeatedly, searching for flaws, imagining alternative scenarios, or reinforcing the belief that one failed morally. The event becomes a loop, a mental movie that plays not to teach, but to punish. Over time, this trapped feeling grows into a habit of self-criticism. The person begins to assume they are always at fault, always responsible for the emotions or misfortunes of others. What started as a specific guilt becomes a general feeling of not being enough. This emotional cycle can be deeply tied to upbringing. Individuals who grew up in environments where mistakes were harshly punished, where parents used guilt as a tool of control, or where affection depended on performance, often internalize guilt as a permanent part of their identity. They learn that being good means never disappointing anyone, never causing conflict, and always placing others first. As adults, this manifests as constant fear of hurting others, fear of being judged, fear of making the wrong choice. Chronic guilt takes root when someone feels responsible for things that are not within their control, another person's feelings, the outcome of a situation, or even events from the past that can no longer be changed. This overwhelming sense of responsibility has serious psychological consequences. One of the most common is anxiety. Chronic guilt and anxiety feed each other in a looping pattern. The guilty mind constantly anticipates mistakes, imagines worst-case scenarios, and stays alert to any sign of disapproval. Even neutral expressions from others can be interpreted as disappointment. The individual becomes hyper-aware, scanning social environments for signs of failure. This heightened sensitivity can lead to social withdrawal, avoidance of important tasks, and inability to set boundaries. Living under the weight of always feeling morally at fault creates a mental state of constant tension. Depression is another frequent companion of chronic guilt. When guilt becomes chronic, it often transforms into a belief not about an action, but about the self. Instead of "I did something wrong," the narrative shifts into "I am wrong." This erosion of self-worth deepens over time. The individual may feel undeserving of forgiveness, kindness, or success. They may engage in self-punishing behaviors, sabotage personal progress, or isolate themselves because they feel they have nothing positive to offer. The emotional heaviness of guilt becomes a lens through which they view their entire life. Depression thrives in this emotional landscape because guilt provides an endless supply of negative thoughts for the mind to amplify. Another dark outcome of chronic guilt is the development of compulsive or perfectionistic behavior. When someone feels that making mistakes is unacceptable or morally dangerous, they may attempt to control every detail of their life to prevent guilt-triggering situations. This can manifest in overworking, excessive apologizing, double-checking everything, or placing unrealistic expectations on themselves. Even then, the person often feels that their efforts are never enough. Perfectionism fueled by guilt is particularly exhausting because it is rooted not in ambition, but in fear. Every decision becomes a trap. No matter what they choose, guilt waits on the other side. Relationships also suffer under the weight of chronic guilt. Individuals may become overly accommodating, agreeing to things they don't want, taking responsibility for conflicts they didn't cause, or suppressing their needs to avoid disappointing others. Over time, this kind of guilt-driven self-sacrifice leads to resentment, emotional burnout, and loss of identity. In some cases, others may exploit this guilt, manipulating the individual or reinforcing their belief that they are at fault. Emotional guilt tripping from partners, friends, or family can intensify the chronic guilt cycle and prevent the person from recognizing their own boundaries. Guilt is one of the most pervasive forces in human relationships. It shapes the way we interact, communicate, and bond with others, often in ways that we barely notice. In relationships, guilt functions as both a regulator and a motivator. It warns us when we have hurt someone, encourages reparative behavior, and keeps connections intact. Yet, it is also complex and can become destructive when mismanaged, creating tension, resentment, or emotional dependency. Understanding guilt in relationships is essential to understanding the delicate balance of intimacy, trust, and moral responsibility between people. From the very beginning of a relationship, guilt plays a role. Even small actions, such as forgetting a promise, neglecting attention, or unintentionally hurting a partner's feelings, can trigger guilt. This emotional signal acts as a moral compass, prompting us to acknowledge our misstep and make amends. Guilt, in this sense, strengthens relationships because it motivates behaviors that repair emotional damage and restore trust. A simple apology, a thoughtful gesture, or a sincere effort to change can turn guilt into a powerful tool for maintaining closeness and mutual respect. Guilt in relationships is closely tied to empathy. When we feel guilt, we are essentially imagining the emotional impact of our actions on someone we care about. This reflective awareness allows us to take responsibility for our behavior and to act in ways that prioritize the other person's well-being. Empathy-driven guilt is particularly important in long-term relationships, where trust and interdependence are essential. It helps partners consider each other's feelings, negotiate conflicts, and maintain a sense of moral accountability that strengthens the bond. However, guilt is not always proportional or productive. In some cases, one partner may feel excessive guilt for actions that are minor or even outside their control. This heightened guilt can stem from personality traits, upbringing, or patterns established earlier in life. For instance, individuals raised in environments where mistakes were harshly punished, or where they were made to feel responsible for others' emotions, often carry disproportionate guilt into adulthood. In relationships, this can manifest as over-apologizing, self-blame, or a constant need to prove worthiness. Rather than guiding behavior, excessive guilt can generate anxiety, tension, and imbalance. Power dynamics further complicate guilt in relationships. Guilt can be manipulated consciously or unconsciously by one partner to influence the other's behavior. Emotional guilt tripping, subtle or overt, can pressure someone into acting against their desires or needs. Statements like, "After all I've done for you," or "If you really love me, you would," leverage guilt to control, creating an unhealthy dynamic. While guilt in its natural form encourages repair and moral reflection, guilt used as a weapon undermines trust, autonomy, and emotional safety. Guilt also interacts with love and attachment. In healthy attachments, guilt serves a reparative function. It motivates individuals to apologize, compromise, or change behavior to protect the relationship. In anxious attachment styles, however, guilt can become chronic, arising from fear of abandonment or perceived inadequacy. A person may feel guilty simply for existing in the relationship, for wanting attention, or for having needs. This type of guilt is not about moral transgression, but about emotional insecurity, and it can lead to patterns of people-pleasing, codependency, and loss of self-identity. Long-term relationships highlight another dimension of guilt: relational memory. Past conflicts, misunderstandings, and perceived failures accumulate, creating a landscape where guilt can resurface repeatedly. A partner may feel guilt for actions taken years ago, revisiting old mistakes in the mind and connecting them to present conflicts. When guilt is anchored in memory rather than current reality, it can perpetuate cycles of apology, overcompensation, and emotional tension, preventing both partners from moving forward. Cultural and social norms also shape guilt in relationships. In many societies, gender expectations influence who is more likely to experience guilt and for what reasons. Women, often socialized to prioritize care, emotional labor, and relational harmony, may feel more guilt for perceived failures in nurturing or maintaining social bonds. Men, depending on cultural context, may experience guilt differently, perhaps tied to financial responsibility, protection, or societal ideals of masculinity. These norms interact with personal psychology to produce unique patterns of guilt that influence relational dynamics. In the digital age, guilt has taken on new forms, extending far beyond face-to-face interactions into the virtual spaces we inhabit every day. Social media, instant messaging, email, and other online platforms have created environments where expectations, visibility, and accountability exist around the clock. Digital guilt is the emotional response that arises when we perceive ourselves as failing to meet these constantly evolving expectations. It is subtle, pervasive, and unlike traditional guilt because it thrives on immediacy, comparison, and the potential for public judgment. Online, the sense of responsibility is amplified. A message left unread, a delayed response, or a missed notification can trigger feelings of guilt, even when no one else notices or complains. The mind interprets these lapses as failures of care, attention, or commitment. In a world where relationships, work, and social standing increasingly intersect with online presence, guilt becomes a constant companion. It signals that we have not adequately maintained our social obligations, that we have fallen short in being responsive, engaged, or supportive. Unlike traditional guilt, which often has a tangible action to repair, digital guilt can linger indefinitely because the virtual environment rarely provides closure. Social media introduces another layer to this phenomenon. Platforms encourage constant engagement, updating, and visibility, while also providing endless opportunities for comparison. Seeing friends, colleagues, or acquaintances sharing achievements, milestones, or curated moments of success can trigger guilt for perceived underperformance, inactivity, or neglect. Users may feel guilty for not posting enough, not responding to comments, or not maintaining an idealized image. In these contexts, guilt is less about moral failure and more about social expectation and self-perception. The boundary between personal responsibility and external pressure blurs, creating an ongoing emotional tension that feeds on self-monitoring and anticipation of judgment. Digital guilt also extends to relational dynamics. Online interactions are uniquely visible, permanent, and sometimes public. Failing to congratulate a friend on a milestone, not liking a post, or not replying promptly can feel like a relational lapse. Even when the other person does not notice, guilt may arise from our awareness of social norms and the implicit rules of online etiquette. Digital environments compress time and attention, magnifying minor oversights into emotional events. Guilt becomes a tool to maintain social bonds, yet it is also a source of stress because the standards are nebulous, constantly shifting, and often culturally influenced by the norms of the online community. Professional life in the digital age amplifies this type of guilt. Work emails, Slack messages, notifications, and project updates create a constant sense of duty. The always-on culture fosters guilt when tasks are delayed, messages go unanswered, or priorities shift. Digital guilt here is tightly linked to productivity, reputation, and perceived competence. Unlike traditional workplaces, where boundaries between work and personal life could be clearer, the online environment blends these spheres, making guilt a near-permanent state for many individuals. People feel responsible for every email they miss, every deadline they cannot meet, and every social cue they fail to acknowledge. One of the distinctive features of digital guilt is its relationship to visibility. Online, actions are often recorded, shared, and visible to a wider audience than ever before. The permanence of digital traces amplifies the stakes. A misstep in a public forum, a misinterpreted comment, or a post that goes unacknowledged can evoke guilt because it is a visible reflection of self-image, social connection, and reputation. This visibility heightens self-consciousness and magnifies emotional response, making guilt more intense and more difficult to resolve than in private, face-to-face interactions. Digital guilt is further complicated by the cognitive load of online engagement. With multiple platforms, messages, notifications, and interactions to manage, individuals often feel they are failing to keep up. The sheer volume of social information creates a fertile ground for guilt, as people feel responsible not only for what they do, but also for what they fail to do. It is a guilt fueled by opportunity, awareness, and comparison, a guilt of omission rather than commission. This type of guilt is often chronic because digital environments rarely provide definitive endpoints or closure. There is always another post to check, another message to answer, another connection to maintain. Guilt is a fundamental human emotion, a signal that we have violated our own values or caused harm to others. While it can guide behavior, strengthen relationships, and promote moral growth, it can also become heavy, persistent, or destructive when left unresolved. Healing and transforming guilt is not about erasing the emotion, but learning to engage with it consciously, to understand its origins, and to channel it in ways that restore balance, empathy, and personal well-being. The first step in healing guilt is awareness. Many people carry guilt unconsciously, feeling its weight without recognizing its source or legitimacy. Identifying the actions, thoughts, or situations that trigger guilt is essential. This requires honest self-reflection and a willingness to examine both internalized expectations and external pressures. Sometimes guilt is justified, rooted in real harm caused to another person. Other times, it is disproportionate, stemming from unrealistic standards, cultural conditioning, or internalized criticism. Distinguishing between these types of guilt allows individuals to respond appropriately, rather than reacting automatically out of habit or fear. Acknowledging guilt without judgment is a crucial aspect of transformation. This involves accepting that guilt is a natural emotional response, not a permanent judgment on one's worth. People often intensify suffering by equating guilt with personal failure, thinking, "I am a bad person because I feel guilty." In reality, guilt is a signal, not a verdict. By reframing guilt as information rather than condemnation, individuals can shift from self-punishment to constructive action. Mindfulness practices, journaling, and therapeutic reflection are valuable tools in cultivating this awareness, providing the mental space to observe guilt without being overwhelmed by it. Repair and reconciliation are key components of transforming guilt. When guilt arises from actions that have harmed others, taking responsibility and making amends can alleviate its intensity. Apologies, restitution, and efforts to restore trust not only relieve personal discomfort, but also strengthen relationships and reinforce moral integrity. The process of repair is deeply human, connecting the emotional experience of guilt to practical action. It turns guilt from a passive burden into an active opportunity for growth and connection. Importantly, the act of repair must be sincere and focused on the needs of those affected, rather than merely a way to alleviate personal discomfort. Self-compassion plays an equally important role. Many people struggle with chronic guilt because they are unable to forgive themselves or to recognize their own humanity. Cultivating self-compassion involves treating oneself with the same care, understanding, and patience that one would offer a friend. It is an acknowledgement that imperfection is inherent to being human, that mistakes are opportunities for learning, and that moral growth is a lifelong process. Practices such as self-affirmation, meditation, and compassionate self-talk can help transform guilt into a teacher rather than a tormentor. Cognitive reframing is another powerful tool in healing guilt. This involves examining the beliefs and narratives that fuel guilt and challenging distortions that exaggerate responsibility or consequence. For instance, someone may feel guilty for failing to prevent an event that was beyond their control. Reframing allows them to recognize the limits of personal responsibility, separating genuine accountability from unrealistic expectations. By reshaping thought patterns, individuals can reduce the intensity of guilt and prevent it from undermining mental health or decision-making. Building supportive social connections is also critical. Sharing feelings of guilt with trusted friends, mentors, or therapists can provide perspective and validation. Sometimes guilt persists because it is experienced in isolation, magnifying self-criticism and rumination. By opening up, individuals receive external insight and emotional support that can help contextualize the situation, reveal overlooked factors, and offer practical advice for resolution. Social connection also reinforces the communal aspect of guilt, reminding us that humans are relational beings whose emotions often exist in a network of shared understanding. Spiritual and philosophical perspectives can further aid in transforming guilt. Across cultures and traditions, practices such as confession, meditation, prayer, and ethical reflection provide structured ways to process guilt. These practices offer ritualized forms of acknowledgement, release, and commitment to moral growth. They allow individuals to externalize responsibility, seek guidance, and connect with broader frameworks of meaning. Whether grounded in religion, philosophy, or personal reflection, these approaches support the integration of guilt into a balanced moral and emotional life.